Hey everybody, welcome to Unscripted, where we're all about inspiring better conversations and helping people think more deeply and critically about faith, life, and leadership. My name is Sam, and it is my great honor to introduce our guest today. Our guest is a coach of mine. He's become a friend of mine. He is a pastor at a church in Phoenix called Christ Church of the Valley. He's been a professor for years at Ozark Christian College, correct?
That's it. You got it.
Awesome. My good friend Mark Moore, thank you for being here.
Oh, I love it. My first time in Ripon. First time in Wisconsin.
Oh, I didn't even know that. First time in Wisconsin. What do you think?
Well, it's pretty cool. We flew down into Appleton and then drove. We're going up into the peninsula for a little R&R because in Phoenix right now it's. Someone asked me the other day, why doesn't your church preach on hell more?
Because that'd be great, right?
Well, because when you live through it, you don't have to convince people of it. So yeah, it's like 110 degrees. And,
oh my!
And we're so it's August is a really good time to get out of town.
It's a fantastic idea. I'm glad you chose to come to Wisconsin for it.
Yeah, and we drove right through Green Bay, and first thing I did was, of course, get off and take a picture in front of the stadium. And
good job. That's like the one thing you got to do in Wisconsin.
And then
right?
ate cheese curds for lunch.
You basically experienced Wisconsin in like 20 minutes.
Exactly. Well, I didn't. What were those pastries? I haven't. Kringle.
Kringle.
Yeah,
yes.
I haven't had a Kringle yet. So,
all right.
But it'll happen.
That sounds good. We'll make sure you get one of those. So, a little bit of backstory. I spent the last year and a half or so spending time with you. We had 3 different times where we went in person, multiple Zoom conversations, part of this cohort thing called Craft and Character.
Yeah.
So part of that is working on the craft of communication and speaking, and you're a fantastic speaker and really great. I would say you're an incredible coach with that because you talk about so many specific things on a wide range of issues that have to do with speaking and how to do that well. But the thing that's really interesting about that cohort was it also talked about character. And I loved our conversations about character with that cohort. And one of the things I want to get into with you for a little bit here is issues of leadership and character. Mm-hmm. And I thought a fun or interesting question to start us off is this. As you guys, you're part of this church, you got like 300 some employees that are part of this church. Yep. When you're thinking about, or someone is trying to be elevated in leadership roles, there's obviously skills that are a part of that. There's know-how, knowledge, but what about character?
Yeah.
How do you actually look at character of a person to determine if somebody is at the right place to elevate in leadership? We have a bunch of people that watch this from different leadership roles, not just church, but it's a part that we don't always think about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, and it actually applies as much to a business person as it does to church leadership. Our church, just to set the context, and we're a freak of nature. I'll just say that. And I want to say our church, before I give you the numbers, your church here in Ripon has 20 times more community impact than our church does in terms of market share. So if you're talking business, your market share is about, I think we figured it up last night to like 20% market share. Ours is 0.1%. Our 0.5% market share. Now, our Phoenix metro area is 4.5 million people. So a church we had 34,000 last weekend in physical attendance.
That's insane. So
we've got the staff of 350. We are an organization and in some ways a business. So your question for me is not just about the character of ministry, but the character of a business, of an organization. So how do we determine when someone is ready to be elevated? The larger we become as an organization, the less skills are important and the more character is important.
Yep.
And it sounds strange when you say it that way, but it's easier to teach someone skill than it is to teach someone character. Yep. And often what happens is people are elevated because of their ability to places their character cannot sustain them. And if let's say our senior pastor had a moral failure, the impact of that is exponentially large.
Yeah.
So if someone has a character deficit, you can always hire someone to come along the edges and backfill those. I'm sorry, not a character deficit, a capacity deficit. You can backfill capacity. You cannot backfill character. So what do we look for? There are 2 things that are at the top of our list, and we actually have 7 virtues that everyone has to align with. Like
sure.
This is that. Well, I'll tell you in brief. It spells the word Christ. So it's kind of an anachronism of Christ. And one is a commitment to excellence, a heart for evangelism. R is relationships. I is integrity. S is servant heart. And T is a team player. So those are the ones I said 7. Those are the 5 primary ones that we evaluate. Beyond those 2 are actually 2 that are elevated even above that.
Okay. What are those 2?
If you want to get fired in our organization, abandon your family, or have some kind of sexual or moral misconduct. It doesn't even have to be an adultery. If you're having an emotional affair, or if you are negligent with your children, or you're have some kind of relational breach with your spouse, you will not be elevated. Because what we know is your family is the foundation of your character. And if things aren't right at home, it doesn't matter how much you perform publicly, you're not going to be able to sustain that leadership role. The second thing is financial integrity. You mismanage funds. And for us, it's even more than that. It is a heart of generosity. So I'll tell you a couple of stories.
Sure.
Our senior pastor, his level of tithe is 50% of his income.
That's a huge amount of income. Yeah.
Well, and you think, well, a guy at a senior pastor of a church with 34,000, he must be getting like $250,000 or $500,000. Nope, it's way less. I don't even know what his salary is.
Sure.
It may be less than mine.
Okay.
Just because he's so committed to being generous, and so his house, he has 3 daughters. He just moved to a new house for security reasons. That's a different story. His house was smaller than mine.
Wild. Because
he is modeling for the rest of us, not just generosity, but just an integrity of I'm not going to drive a fast car. I think he drives like a Honda Accord or something like that, and that kind of model is really critical. I'll tell you how I got on his good side. I was raised by a father who was, I don't want to say, it wasn't greedy, but he would call it frugal. I would call it cheap.
Okay.
I realized in my early 20s that I was selfish financially. And I didn't want to be, because that's a character issue. So I decided as a spiritual discipline, every time I go out to eat, I'm going to be the first one to put the credit card on the table.
Sure.
I hate it. It's painful even now. Like I've become a much more generous person, but that discipline is not natural for me. It is a discipline to grow in my generosity. So I came up with another rule to help me grow in this area, because I needed to grow. And that was, if you ever compliment me for something that I'm wearing or something I have, I give it away.
So you literally get like the shirt off your back, right?
I have done it.
Okay.
Like I've literally done that.
If you're listening, you want a new wardrobe.
That's right. This is Lululemon, so go for it.
Awesome.
I could care less about my possessions. There was one time that a friend of mine was over. He was a preacher in Texas, and I inherited some books from my grandfather, who graduated from seminary in 1917.
Wow.
So I had a copy of the pulpit commentaries, complete copy of the pulpit commentaries from 1901.
That seems like a pretty big deal.
And I was bragging. I had built a case for them, and I opened the doors, and there they were. I mean, they were behind closed doors. That's how much I read them. They're behind, like I never touched them.
Yeah.
And his mouth fell open. He goes, "Oh man, those are incredible.
Yeah.
I would love to have something like that." And I turned to my wife and said, "Go get some boxes." She's like, "You can't." No, I have to. It's not because I'm generous. It's because I'm not that I have to. So when Ashley came, the last chapel I spoke in at Ozark Christian College, they had hired me. He actually flew out to be at my last chapel. And he comes to my office and he sees these 2 ancient lamps, like oil lamps. One was from the 1st century. It was like, could have been burning in a room that Jesus was. It was within 13 miles of Jesus and at the same time, that's contemporary. There was another lamp that was from the Middle Ages, both of them given to me as a gift by a friend.
Yeah.
And Ashley said, those are incredible. And I just picked up one of them and handed it to him because you can't do that. No, I can't not do that. And so from that, like Ashley thinks I'm more generous than I actually am because I gave him this gift that he couldn't have gotten any other way. So
that's awesome. I'm curious. You did something there, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I love it. So you practice something that's counter to what you know you are.
That's right.
How did you pick that up? And how is that like a spiritual discipline? Do you teach that to other people when they're struggling with things? Like that's something I haven't heard that often, like to make it a practice to do the opposite thing that you naturally do, just like right there, like that. It's like such a focused thing that you're doing.
I think it actually, Sam, came from the Holy Spirit because I used, in my very first ministry, San Antonio, Texas, we're talking like 1985 to 1990. My best friend there, a guy named Doug Marks, who's still a very dear friend of mine, every time we'd go out to lunch, he would pay.
Okay.
And I would let him. And I began to realize he has the character that I want. So if I want that character, I need to imitate that behavior. And I began to realize I'm cheap, I'm stingy, I don't tip well, and that had to change. And so as painful as it wasn't necessarily that I was trying to be a good person. I was just trying to be a less crappy person.
It's good. I like that. I like that you're a less crappy person. So
yeah.
So you do this imitation thing. That's right out of Paul, right? He says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So it's amazing. How does a culture form around that? If you're leading a business, if you're leading any group of people, how do you find ways to make that actually happen? Because you can't just put things on a plaque somewhere and say, we're going to do that. You actually have to do it. Like, what are the things that at CCV, like, how do you guys make those values actually get imitated?
Yeah, so there's really there's three ways organizationally that you can embed values into people. One is to preach it, and it has to be front and center, front and center, front and center, front. You can't let up. And one of the mistakes I'll get to all three, but one of the mistakes organizations make is because I said it, as a leader, you hear yourself say this like 3 times a day.
Yeah.
People don't even hear you say it once until you've said it 10 times. And so you get the impression that I'm saying this all the time, but that's really not the case. You have to keep repeating what is important to you because you also have new people coming in. So at this church, you're going to have new people coming in all the time, every week. You have to keep repeating it until it becomes in the air. And so if you ask 10 people at your church, what's the mission of this church? How many of those 10 can just rattle it off? It has to become a choral refrain. Second thing is there has to be a reward or punishment system behind it. Reward what you want to replicate.
Okay, I'm curious about the punishment side of this. But yeah, reward what you want to replicate. Go for that first, and then I want to get back to the punishment.
Well, the punishment and reward are the same thing. If you want to raise in the organization, we're gonna elevate people who demonstrate these five core characters that we keep repeating. And the punishment is you don't get elevated or you get released, or we just make your job. We don't fire a lot of people, but we'll relegate them to a place where they're unsatisfied and we'll leave.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I'm curious, that's super interesting. You actually think about punishment. And I don't mean to like sound vindictive, but I think often we don't realize that there should be those pieces. And then to like actually make a particular set of values be elevated, you have to be really thoughtful about what you're rewarding and what you're not rewarding. I guess
that's right. Doing. People change because of pain.
Yeah.
I mean, let's just be honest. Mm-hmm. We don't change as much from reward as we often do from pain. So when something gets pain, like every addict knows, you have to hit bottom before you go to AA or whatever it is you're struggling with. When people feel the pain of their behavior, that's when they're more open to change.
It's real.
So repeat your values, and then actually put a reward scale, something tangible, where if I do this thing, I get rewarded. If I don't do this thing, I'm punished in some way or held back in some way. The third thing is you have to model it. And Ashley models it with a 50% tithe. I model it by giving stuff away. And when people see their leaders modeling the behavior, if they want to be like you, they start to do what you do. So people don't do what you say, they do what you do.
Okay, how do you not make it so that it becomes a reward basis simply for success? So how do you keep it where character is front and center, and you don't just go to, hey, this person led this ministry, that ministry grew, so we're going to reward them just for that? How do you weed out that temptation, or like keep yourself in check with that temptation?
We don't reward people for growing their ministries. We reward people for the character that they're showing. So if it's connected with success in that way, I don't care. So the answer to your question is I don't care. If I'm rewarding you for success, if my metric of success is the demonstration of your behavior, I can't really reward your character because I can't get inside your soul. I can reward your behavior.
Yeah.
It is virtually impossible for you to enact ethical behaviors and not become ethical.
Okay. Yep, I'm tracking.
Particularly because when you begin, it's not just the behaviors that you're seeing and the results of those behaviors, there's feelings behind it. So let's get back to generosity. There's other character issues, but let's just stick with generosity. Jesus said, and interestingly, you just finished a series on Acts. Yeah. This is the only thing Jesus said that wasn't recorded in the Gospels.
Yep.
It is more blessed to give than to receive.
Well, yeah. Okay. So, keep going with it.
So at Christmas, do you enjoy opening a present or watching someone open your present more? All of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
All of us would rather have watch someone open a present we gave.
Absolutely.
The feeling you get from that, and this is actually, I'm going to get into a little bit of science here. God made happiness a chemical in your brain. There's actually 3 chemicals in your brain, serotonin, oxytocin, and dopamine. Mm-hmm. And what God did was he made these chemicals extremely addictive, which is why meth is so addictive, because it creates that chemical impulse. But each of these chemicals, when naturally reoccurring in your body, also dissipate quickly, which is a brilliant strategy, because now I make something addictive to you that it dissipates quickly, so you have to replicate the behavior that got the chemical rush. So a hug is this oxytocin. So I give you a hug, and that bonds us together, like chemically bonds us together, and then it dissipates, so I hug you again. Mm-hmm. Or I show respect, or I show kindness, or I do this random act of beauty for someone. Those things, the addiction that dissipates quickly causes repeated replication. This is a little bit complicated, but
it makes sense.
What God did was genius. And I think organizationally, we don't have to actually give these massive rewards for these ethical behaviors, but these small recognitions of reward. And I'm not even talking about compensation. Compensation, this is from a business standpoint, compensation is one of the least effective ways of getting people to stay at your organization. Significance is far more effective in getting behaviors to replicate and keeping people on long term. So by honoring people publicly, by verbally recognizing them in front of other people for behaviors that we want replicated, we found that to be far the most effective way of character development.
So interesting, because I had a friend of mine, we chatted on the podcast a number of weeks back, and he's a chemistry professor up in college. And he talked all about dopamine. We had a long dopamine conversation. It was really fun. But the interesting thing about that chemical system is you can get hijacked. Like that's what the meth thing is, right? It can get hijacked. But a good organization, what I hear you saying is, can realize that that's reality. That's how God designed us. Mm-hmm. So let's actually look at the ways that we can help people desire to repeat certain behaviors that are actually helpful to the culture.
Helpful to them, helpful to the others, helpful to the culture. Absolutely.
Awesome. And it's interesting because you don't ever want it to be like behavior manipulation, but at the same time, this is the imitation side of things. Like you don't learn by learning facts, you learn by imitating more often than not.
That's
Like
right.
You watch someone else do it, you do it more so. And that's why we're told to imitate Jesus.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm not against manipulation.
Tell me about that, because that's what I kind of thought you might say.
Every parent does it.
That's
Every spouse
That's
does
true.
it. Every boss does it. Here's the. So this we're talking earlier over coffee about my dissertation in Europe.
Yeah.
It was about the politics of Jesus and how Jesus was actually a political figure.
Absolutely.
The reason we don't see him as a political figure is because he used power. Politics is power. It's about the use of power and the use of power to create a community. That's politics. It goes back to the Greek word polis, which means city, or community. So if you want to create community, the political system is how you do it. What made Jesus so unique is that he had power, but he never used power for the two things that literally every other politician uses power for: self-protection and self-promotion. Jesus never used power. So you're thinking, I don't care if it's city government or church politics or international politics. Politicians use power for self-promotion and self-protection. Jesus used power only for the powerless.
That's wild. So when you talk about manipulating being a good thing, using power as
It's
a
how
good
you
thing,
use power.
man.
When you use manipulation for selfish means, it is satanic. When you use power to manipulate a child to grow, to mature, to learn, to be a decent citizen, that's good parenting.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Man, this is fun. I mean, I want to go into politics now, but we'll see. Maybe we'll circle back to that. I do want to steer us a little different direction for a moment because I did want to get to this conversation. We talk about speaking a lot when we've spent this last year talking about how to communicate well and all these different things. And you spent 20 years at Ozark?
22. Yeah.
22 years and 10 years as the teaching pastor at CCV. You think about how to communicate the Bible all the time.
All the time.
And a large part about that is translation or interpretation, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're interpreting it for the people. As you've gone through those 30 years, what are some of like the most significant things you've learned, you've decided are important for how to do that interpretation process, for how to do that translation process so that people hear and understand? Like there's Old Testament parts where people are weeping because they finally understand.
Yeah.
Like, how have you understood that, and how has that become important to you?
I love this question, Sam. Let me zero in on a few things, and I don't mean to be this to be self-promotion at all. At Christ Church of the Valley, we're a church that attracts thousands of people.
Yes.
Which means we have 1,000 weirdos. Like we have 1,000 people who think they know the Bible. Don't know the Bible. Like how do I get the Bible into their hands? Because one of the things that we know, we're not even guessing, this is sociological research. Reading the Bible on your own 4 days a week or more puts you in a category called Bible engaged.
Okay.
So how many of your people at Ripon Community Church read the Bible 4 days a week or more? They're Bible engaged. You take all Bible engaged people, put them next to non-Bible engaged people. It doesn't matter if they're Christian, atheist, pagan, it doesn't matter. The stats of your life are staggeringly different if you read the Bible. For example, sexual immorality drops by 60% in Bible engaged people. Gambling addictions by 75%. Self-esteem rises by an average of 30%. Isolation drops by an average of 30%. So I'm thinking, how can I get people into the Bible? What you and I have done as preachers, we've really screwed people up. Because what we do is we tell them, read the Bible.
Yeah.
And they go and they buy one of these like family Bibles, probably King James Version. And it thuds on the desk, and they go, "Okay, Pastor told me to read the Bible, so you start with Genesis." And that's kind of cool because you got creation, and then you've got, Noah, the flood. That's an interesting story. Then you got, some sexual immorality. We're all interested in that. So you read through Joseph and all that stuff. Exodus is pretty cool too because you got the plagues and the sea crossing. You like Charlton Heston movie. It's great. Makes a great movie. Then you get to Leviticus,
and everything stops.
and I'm done. Although this is hilarious. Did you know that Leviticus was the first book that little Jewish boys memorized?
That's hilarious.
It is. And
Learn the rules.
Well, it's not that. It's that you've got blood, death, knives, and fire. And so every ADHD Jewish boy is like going, like, I've seen that. I can memorize that.
Yeah.
But for most of us, it's like, I'm done. I'm out. How do we then, with a book that is as big as the Bible, and most men don't read, sorry, they just don't, is as big as the Bible and is culturally different enough that it feels foreign. How do you get people to read a big foreign book that doesn't seem relevant? That was my challenge. And so I wrote a book about that called Core 52, which took the 52 most impactful passages of all the Bible, and we just give a simple 1-week lesson with some application. What I've found is that when you tell people this daunting task, read the Bible, they get intimidated. But if we can break it down into bite-sized chunks. So I would say to all of you watching this podcast, you don't have to read every word of every book of the entire Bible. Find a reading plan that will give you the bits that will most impact your life, because it's life impact that will draw you back to reading of Scripture.
Okay. Impact.
So that's one of my answers to your question. Here's another one. This is super practical for when you're reading the Bible. I have simplified the process for the common person. Read one chapter a day.
That's one chapter away, keep the doctor away, right?
Just read one chapter. Now, in that chapter, it might take 5 minutes. You can underline or highlight whatever you want. But at the end of your 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it is, you have to underline one verse that you're going to put into practice. Like, you're going to do that. Now, you can't do it all day, so don't be an overachiever. Just take one verse, and then for 1 hour that day, try to live that verse. Just 1 hour. Mm-hmm. If you do that, your life will radically transform. One chapter, one verse, 1 hour. That I have found to be an incredibly effective Bible study technique.
You got it. I think that's awesome. I think that's brilliant, because we talk about this a lot, and you just gave some statistics, right? You actually read it, it changes your life. You actually have a transformation that happens just by being part of it. I'm curious, as you're standing up on a stage or you're prepping for a sermon for weeks, and you're thinking about what is the message that I want. Are you doing something similar even there? Like, you're doing what you're teaching other people to do. You're just bringing it down to like one thing.
Yeah, if I don't have my sermon in a single sentence, I'm not ready to write the outline.
So you get your sermon down to one sentence and then you write the outline?
Not exactly. I start I can't help it because my brain is going like a squirrel cage, but I'll get different points of the outline. But until I have it in a single sentence, and that single sentence for me, this is not individual Bible study, but this is for me communicating.
Yeah,
I have to know what is the question that I'm answering that people are asking. When I taught at Bible college, my primary question was, is it true? I got into the church and I changed questions. Now, I'm not going to preach something that's not true.
No.
But I can preach something that's true and it's not helpful. So my question now is, what is helpful? What do people need to know? So the next sermon I'm preaching is on the prayer of Elijah. He prayed to God, and it didn't rain for 3.5 years. So now we're talking about prayer. How do I help people pray in a way that is going to bring power into their lives?
Yeah.
So I probably won't do this exact thing, but it took me, and I was Bible college trained, right? It took me about 10 years into my marriage before my wife and I prayed together outside of meals. Most people have no clue how to do that. And so here's a simple thing that you can do. When I coach guys in praying with their wife, I say, okay, find a time that's good for her, not good for you, but it has to be a ritual time. Because you're the spiritual leader, adjust to her schedule. If she's an evening person, do it in the evening. If she's a morning person, do it in the morning. So her schedule dictates the time you pray together. We're only talking about 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. When you pray, find a spot, and it's the same spot every day. It has to be a ritual, or it won't be permanent. And you sit in that spot, and you wait for her to come sit next to you. Like, you start it. You initiate. You choose her time, but then you start it. You initiate. She comes and sits next to you. You take her hand, and there's 3 things that you should pray for. And if you do this, prayer is an aphrodisiac.
Somehow I knew you were going to say something like that. That's awesome.
It is. In fact, it's so much so that I encourage couples who are engaged not to pray intimately together, because it actually is an intimacy issue.
Yeah.
So here are the 3 things. Number 1, brag about your wife to God.
That's beautiful.
Oh, it's incredible. Say the things to God that you say about your wife to other people when she's not around. Mm-hmm. Let her eavesdrop. Second thing, pray to God about your schedule. Because all the time I'll pray about something that's coming up in my day, and after the amen, my wife will go, I didn't know you're doing that.
That's like every day.
Yeah.
I feel that, at least. And
then third thing is pray to God what you're afraid of. So that your spouse can hear. And this is men for women. For women, it might be different things you pray about for men. But for a man to pray with his wife, that is such a simple. Nobody taught me how to do that. I had to figure that out on my own. Like, literally, nobody told me how to pray with my wife.
Yeah.
That has changed so many men's marriages.
I bet.
Just offloading that. So in a sermon, how can you give something that is not just truthful, but helpful? And that should be every sermon.
Yeah, and I love how you talk about when you're thinking about what you're communicating, because if you're listening and you're not giving a sermon, but you're talking to different people, getting it down to a sentence, nobody wants to listen to a lecture for 3 hours or 20 minutes even that is rambling, but to get it down to one sentence, that works for all communication. I have one more question for you.
Okay.
I feel like we could talk for another 3 hours, but I have one more question. You can talk about politics, so I'm just going to circle around back to that. And it's not the question you think, I think. So we have this focus for this year called Represent Jesus Well. We're going to do everything we can to represent Jesus well. And that means that you can't fake it. You got to actually live it and do it and have that internally change you. But that's a political statement. When you talk about representation, you're representing someone. And I'm curious, as you think about the cultural context we live in right now, I don't know that, especially evangelical Christians or people that would say I'm following Jesus and I come to a church that's got great music, all that kind of thing. That's often where we're at. I would say that there's not always a great reputation of people representing Jesus well. What would it look like to represent Jesus well in this political climate? In America, in Phoenix and Ripon.
Well, it's an interesting question for me, because I often conclude my messages after the amen by giving this sign. I did this in class as well. I'd say, I love you guys, and dismiss class, but I do this, and I say, let's go make Jesus famous.
Yeah.
Let's make Jesus famous is actually a theologically laden statement. It sounds like, kitschy a little bit, but in the ancient world of patron-client, which we won't go, if you look it up online yourself, but a patron-client system, you have one person who is responsible for all the people of the community. And Jesus lived in that patron-client system. The obligation of the patron was to provide all the needs of his clients. And there's a Greek word for that, grace. Then the obligation of the clients was to make famous their patron, to brag about him and to talk about how good he is. And the word for that is loyalty, translated in the Bible as faith. Faith is not believing in Jesus, it's being loyal to Jesus to exalt him as a patron so that he can draw other clients in. So the whole Great Commission is simply making Jesus famous, that's another way of saying we want to represent Jesus well.
Yeah.
I'll say one other thing and then actually answer the question. Jesus, or Paul in Philippians said, live a life worthy of your calling. Now, Philippi was a Roman colony, meaning that it had the rights and privileges of Rome in a distant place. So Philippi is in the country of Greece. Rome is the next country over, but they lived like Romans, even though they weren't living in Rome.
Yeah.
That's the word politeuomai, from which we get the word politics. Live a life worthy is politeuomai. Live in such a way that you're representing the mother country or the mothership. And to live here as if heaven were here. So that's the background for me to answer the question. Now I'm going to answer the question.
I love it.
I think a lot of people don't like church.
Mm-hmm.
More people like the Bible than like church. And more people like Jesus than like the Bible. So how is it that we can live a Jesus life, not just a Bible life, and not just a church life, but live a Jesus life? And I'm going to give you this is a simple rule, and then I'll give some specifics. Jesus did something, I think one of the most important moments of all human history was when he reached out and touched the leper.
Yeah.
Because everyone thought that the leper's uncleanness would pass to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, and he was the first one in human history. Like, if I wasn't a Christian, I would still say this. As a historian, he was the first one to assume that cleanness was more contagious than uncleanness.
Mm-hmm.
Consequently, from that moment on, being a follower of Jesus meant breaking barriers because you could. Religious people can't break barriers because they assume that uncleanness will contaminate them. Christians assume that their cleanness will contaminate other people with cleanness.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we can afford to break barriers without defending positions. Where churches have gone wrong is that they're internally focused. We're trying to get people into a church, not just into a building, but into a system. Yeah. And you measure your Christianity by how many rules you follow and how many barriers you build between you and the icky person.
Yeah, you're right.
There's actually a social scientific term for that called taboo or uncleanness, that contagion. Right now, we are in a culture. Now, I'm going to get very specific answering your question. We are in a culture that assumes contagion at every level.
Yeah. So
for some people, eating meat is contagion. And if you eat meat, they look at you as if you are an inferior human being, and there's a barrier. If you vote Democrat or if you vote Republican, we assume now the other person doesn't have a different opinion, but they are unclean, and I build a barrier to protect myself from your uncleanness. Fox versus CNBC, we no longer have standard news. We have news that is idiosyncratic to the camp that we're in, so that we can only watch one channel and build a barrier because everyone else is lying.
Yeah, that's exactly what everybody thinks.
As Christians, those barriers mean nothing to us.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't assume that, which is now not just a religious assumption, but a cultural assumption that the other is unclean. I don't have to make that assumption because I assume that the cleanness of Jesus is more contagious than any uncleanness, whether it's a political opinion, whether it is a chemical, whether it's a lifestyle, whether it's an ethnic group. I can cross any barrier because I am above your earthly politics. My cleanness will be contagion. Jesus put it this way: be salt and light in the world.
Yeah.
So I think one of the is, and so now we'll get just like brass tacks. What are some simple things that we can do? Stop criticizing the other, because you don't have to. That's a way of building a bridge.
I love how you say you don't have to.
You don't have to.
It's just freeing.
It's freeing. Here's another thing that I think is super important, especially post-COVID. COVID isolated people. We now have so few places for intimacy and connection. It used to be that when someone invited, like we had someone else who wanted to invite to church, I would invite them to church first.
Yeah.
And then I would invite them to a neighborhood group or a group that I'm in. And then I would invite them to a mission trip.
Yep.
Now it's the opposite.
Mission trip first.
A community service project is an easy invite for someone outside of Christ. And then a group that I'm meeting with, because people need connection. So if we just did those two things, invited people into our small groups, our community groups and social service projects, and we just didn't criticize other people, that would be incredible.
I completely agree. I think that's a beautiful, simple two things that people can do to represent Jesus well. And man, I want to keep talking, but I'm out of time. So I so appreciate this, Mark. This has been so much fun. It is an honor to have you here with me today.
It's an honor.
I hope you enjoyed listening. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sam.
You bet. With that, we're out.